evening to the BCS Nottingham and Derby branch. We've got an event this evening, Non-Azure Machines with Azure, presented by Richard Harrison, who will be with us shortly. If we could just remind everybody of some etiquette, to keep your microphones off and the video off during the presentations, and the questions will be towards the end. Please use the question pane if available. Otherwise, put your questions in the chat window. Be aware of others, be welcoming, be understanding, friendly, and be kind and considerate. Thank you. If you could all possibly using your mobile phones and using the camera or a QR reader, or by typing in the URL that's at the bottom of that page. This allows us to understand who's on the event for inclusion and diversity. It is anonymous. It just asks you questions and that's all collated together, but without any identifying information. I'll give you a moment to get that, and we will put the link in the chat window shortly for those joining us a little later. A little bit about our group. With details, you can find us. The URL is a little long, which you'll see at the bottom. However, there is a QR code available there that will take you to the site. And on there, you can find details out about the group, the committee, and the upcoming and past events. Our next two events in October and November are available now for you to book onto. The first one in October is a joint event with SciSec, with speakers Peter Wood and Ashley Winton. And our November event, our speaker is Paul, I'm not going to attempt to say his surname, apologies, What Has Enterprise Architecture Brought Us. You can get the links to those two events on our website or use the convenient QR codes available there. And now we'll hand over to, apologies, Richard, for this this event. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'll take over the screen share. Yes. Screen one. Let me just get this into presenter mode. And then we can kick off. There we go. So the topic this evening is non-Azure machines with Azure. So before I get into that, I'm just going to do a quick intro just on me, and then a little bit about who I work for, and then we'll get into the detail. So a little bit about me. So originally a geology graduate. That's what that little picture at the bottom left is meant to represent. So spent a long time studying dinosaurs, volcanoes, rocks, etc. Got to the end of the course and kind of realized there's very little job opportunities in this. Luckily at the time, we were kind of pre-millennium bug and IT was really booming, and I kind of fell into IT at that point. They're not as dissimilar as you might think. They both involve kind of a lot of logical thinking, so actually the transition across was fairly easy. So I started off in various roles on a graduate scheme, but quite quickly moving into a database team, and I spent about the next 20 years focusing on the database side of things. I then I saw a demo of Amazon Web Services and some of their platform database offerings, and as soon as I saw that demo, I kind of saw where the industry was heading, and I needed to look for a change. And luckily within the company, we had a project that was running on Azure. I managed to get involved in that, and then things have snowballed from there. So for about the last 5 years, I've been doing Azure work within the company. And the last little picture there is just to represent I'm quite a keen runner. That kind of gets me away from the screen, and in COVID times has really helped kind of just escape the pressures of daily life. I do blog at the top here. You can see from the name of it, it's kind of linked back to my database days, and a lot of the old content is database related, but the more recent stuff is around Azure if you're interested. Not so many posts recently. I've just been too busy to really put the content up there. There's contact email there, and then if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, the direct link is there. So moving on, just a little bit about Uniper. You may have seen a similar slides before, because a couple of my colleagues have given presentations here. But just to say about Uniper, so we're a big player in the energy markets, covering lots of different areas of that, everything from the generation of the power in the first place, activities around gas storage and distribution, trading of that energy. So a huge kind of spectrum of things within the energy industry. And what I wanted to kind of highlight that means there's a lot of IT in there. So a lot of complexity and a mix of really kind of high-end IT, I would call it. So kind of algorithmic trading, where you've got really kind of, well, futuristic isn't maybe the right word, but really kind of cutting-edge technology. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got kind of machines connected to weighbridges, weighing a truck full of coal, and kind of everything in between. So there's a huge amount of IT backing that up. And the map at the top is to kind of highlight we've got a presence in most of these countries, or at least we have big dealings with these countries. So we are a global player, primarily in Europe, but we are global, quite a big presence in North America. So that's just to highlight we have got a lot of stuff, a lot of IT. So moving on to the topic for tonight. So what are we here to talk about? So that kind of IT I've mentioned, that large volume of IT, we've been on a journey. I mentioned, so 5 years ago we started out in Azure, but then over the past 5 years there have been a number of migration projects and a number of new applications that have been deployed that have now gone into Azure, and then Azure really is our primary platform. We've got a cloud first strategy, and you have to have a really good reason now not to be going into Azure. So this is now huge from an operational point of view. We really like what Microsoft have done. We're really heavy users of that Azure portal. But what we found is not everything can go in there. So some stuff is kind of in the pipeline to move in, but some stuff has to remain on premises. There's some requirement that it needs to be local in a power generation site, or maybe there's some legal or compliance reason that it needs to be in country and can't be in public cloud. So the question we had is, well, how can we effectively manage all this other stuff that we can't put into Azure? Is there a way we can do it from a single pane of glass view and utilize the Azure portal? Well, until 2 years ago, we couldn't. There was no way of doing this. You'd have to use some third-party tool or something else to manage stuff as a whole. But yeah, roughly 2 years ago, Microsoft launched a feature called Azure Arc. Now, it doesn't stand for anything. I kind of thought it might be an abbreviation for something, but it's not. It's just a brand name. So what Azure Arc enables us to do is then bring these things onto a central viewpoint. So if I skip to the next slide, this is pinched from the Microsoft documentation, and it's just to highlight where Azure Arc is pitched in the Microsoft world. So down the bottom here, there's kind of us, there's the end users, and this is then the core kind of Azure tooling platform. And what Azure Arc will enable us to do is all of our other landing zones, whether that's another cloud provider, so Amazon, Google, or whoever, whether it's a traditional on-premises estate, or whether it's some edge location where we're doing some processing locally in a site and maybe just shipping some of the summarized data into the cloud. What Azure Arc enables us to do is to fetch all of these kind of disparate sources into that central Azure management plane. So this is what Azure Arc is all about, is bringing it all into one single view. So with that said, how do you enable it? It's fair enough saying you just connect it up, but how does that actually work? So in terms of onboarding, there's a couple of different methods to use, but essentially ultimately what it's doing is just installing a little bit of software on the server that you want to manage. That can be pushed directly from the portal, or you can script it, you can roll it out in bulk across a number of servers. But the aim is just to get this agent installed onto the server. It's a very small piece of software, very simple. And in terms of network connectivity, so this was one of our initial questions was, well, what connectivity is actually needed for this to be able to talk back? Well, thankfully, all it needs is HTTPS on 443 outbound. So all connectivity is issued this way around. So in terms of kind of firewall requests or security approvals, that makes things a lot simpler. There's no requirement for ports to be opened back the other way. Some communication does kind of come this way, but it's always initiated from here. So you only need to allow outbound connectivity to the Azure Arc endpoints. Now those endpoints can just be public internet, or it can be reached over ExpressRoute to the same addresses, or more recently, Microsoft have announced it's now available to use with Private Link, which enables the addresses you're sending the data to be private 10 dot address ranges. So you can completely keep it off the public internet should you wish to. I mean, it's all encrypted anyway, but if you really want to be extra secure, you can send that traffic via private addressing. So that's the initial setup. It's just install the simple agent. So whether that's physical machine, a virtual machine, or another public cloud provider, the process is the same. So once that agent's installed, what do we get? Now, hopefully this is readable. I appreciate that's fairly small. But after that initial agent install, there's not a lot that it's done actually. So it's connected things up. It gives you a little bit of information about the OS version of things here, but not a lot else. One thing that it does do that's useful, it enables you to tag the servers. Now, for those of you not familiar with Azure, that's just a label. So what you can do is you can kind of set a tag to say, or who it belongs to, maybe the application it belongs to, or some kind of brief description. So you can build up a very basic kind of configuration management database of mapping servers to kind of application properties or things that are useful from a management point of view. You can kind of see hints at other things that are possible, but after this initial phase, there's actually not more than this. The actual Arc agent is more an enabler to do other things. So with that said, let's move on to how we do those other things and how we enable that. So the first stage of what we want to do is we click on this extensions blade, and that then shows us 3 options of extra things we can then push to the server to collect other things for us. So I'm going to ignore the SQL Server one for today. The top one enables us to just run a script remotely on the server. So similar to PowerShell remoting. So that's maybe not overly useful because PowerShell remoting is already there, or remoting onto Linux boxes is probably already in place. What is the interesting one is this log analytics agent. So I then click this or script it to roll it out in bulk, and I push this additional agent out onto the servers. And this is where it starts fetching stuff that's actually useful to us. So briefly, you can see straight away, it's fetching some IP address information, when it was last booted, along with some basics about the kind of size of the server that's being fetched from. But it's still at this point, that's kind of, so what, that's still fairly basic. But moving on, this is where it gets more interesting. So that agent we've just pushed then starts collecting a whole load of metrics about what's happening on that server. So you can see here some basics on disk usage, CPU. It's not on the screen, but there's also kind of all the stuff you'd expect. There's network, there's memory, etc. So that's all fetched back. And you can see here that's by default, it's just showing the past hour, but you can set that back to a month by default and any kind of time window within that month to see what's happening. And if you change the data retention of what the agent's fetching, you can extend that then further into the past. There's more costs to then do that, as you've got to pay for the extra storage space essentially. But that's a choice you might want to make, whether that's going to be useful to you or not. And actually, for us, this first screen was actually one of the most useful things we got immediately. out of Azure Arc. So we were finding that from our current suppliers, even finding some of this basic information about what's happening on the server, while possible, it wasn't that straightforward, and we couldn't just kind of do it ourselves and get this easy overview of what's happening. And one of the things we wanted to be able to do was in our kind of what we have what we call a kind of managed cloud environment, where it's not public cloud, it's managed by a supplier, but we do have some cloud-like features like the ability to scale up and scale down servers. But what we didn't easily know is, well, is the server too big, too small? And this instantly gives us that visibility. So you can see in a simple case here, at least in the past hour, this server really isn't doing anything. So if I scroll back and see a similar pattern, this is in a very easy target we can see to shrink to a smaller size of machine perhaps, and then save some money from that third party. So we get that instant visibility. Moving on, so I'm going to click on this, the next tab here, this map view. So the next thing it enables, so still from this same agent that we've just pushed, it shows us a nice view of kind of networking view of things. So the object here represents our server. I've not expanded it, but if I click that, it would show all of the current running processes, and then the lines from those processes would then map to these remote servers. So we get a nice overview of what's connected where, and actually clients that are connected into this server. And this was our kind of second really useful requirement. So having this view and having this data, when we're looking at migrating some of these services into Azure, this very quickly gives us a view of, oh, okay, we know it's connecting to this. We're probably going to need firewall requests to enable this communication, and we need to consider this interface, and it's fetching all of that information for us into a single screen. So as well as input for that process, it's just nice from an application management point of view, just to see kind of what's happening, what's connected where. And you can see it's got that same ability to go back in time. So you could perhaps see what the connections look like a day ago, a week ago, if you're trying to troubleshoot. So that's all useful data that's being fetched. Now, as well as this being viewable in these kind of graphical screens, what's actually happening in the background is that agent's collecting all those metrics, all that data, and it's pushing it to a feature of Azure called Log Analytics, which, if you're familiar with Splunk, it's that kind of same technology. It's just enables you to kind of stream a whole lot of data to this bucket, and then you can query that data and kind of extract kind of information from that data. So what Microsoft have done in their graphical screens is they're querying that back and giving us some built-in graphics for us. But we also have the ability to query it ourselves. So I've blanked out some of the stuff here, which makes it not as easy to read. But what it enables us to do is this object here, this insights metrics, is kind of a bucket of data. If you're familiar with SQL, you can kind of think of it as a table. And this language here that we use to query that table is called KQL or Custo. So if you're familiar with databases or SQL, this might look quite familiar to SQL, but it's along the same lines. You get the idea. Is I'm querying that table, I'm going to call it, for the processor usage, and I'm averaging that over a 15-minute interval. So I can see that every 15 minutes, I can see the average CPU usage. So the ability to write these queries and pick out any of those metrics and look for any kind of pattern is really powerful. In this case, I'm just doing it for a single server. But what then makes it much more powerful is the ability to do that across multiple servers. So what I've done here is I've changed the scope level. And when I've done that, I've blanked it out here, but I've chosen the whole Log Analytics workspace, or that the kind of the whole bucket that all of the agents are sending to. And then what I'm doing is I'm doing the same query. I've just added on an extra little bit where I'm saying, well, the average CPU usage is more than 90%, and I'm kind of grouping it by computer. Now, it's because I've blanked it out, this doesn't really display that well, but what this would actually show is then a list of every server that ARC's installed on, where the average CPU usage was over 90. So it enables us to quickly kind of look at a whole group of servers for a certain kind of metric or value. So flipping this round back to my cost case, if I change this to be, I guess the average is maybe less than 5% or something, I could then quickly build a list of the servers that look like they're too big. And then I've got my hit list to say to the application managers, go and have a look. Looks like this server is too big. There's potentially a cost saving option here. So this is really powerful, this language, and the ability to query across all of the servers that are sending data in. And then taking that one stage further again, this is the other benefit, and this is the kind of single pane of glass view. One of the other, again, I'm going to call it a table. One of the other tables that is populated is the one we saw earlier, where it's showing the network connectivity, or what's connected to what. But what I've done here is I've done it across the whole of Azure. So this same table, as long as you've set it up, is also populated for all your Azure-based machines. So then I can combine all of Azure with all of non-Azure and report on the thing as a whole. So what I'm doing here is just to explain a little. I've removed the IP addresses, but these 3 IP addresses for NetApp filers, and this is file services traffic. And then what I'm displaying is the amount of data that's been sent in or received, and then I'm summing everything up to just show the total traffic sent to and from NetApp, and then grouped by a computer. So that's really powerful, the ability to do that across the entirety of the estate. Then what I've done below, which is maybe outside the scope of going into too much detail, but I've used a feature called Azure Workbook, and this then enables me to nicely visualize that. So it's all I've done is that's the query behind it. This just makes it look nice. So I've blanked out the computer names, but this would show the computer name, and then this is the total amount of traffic that's gone to and from those filers. So then you get an easy, simple, nice visual report of what are the big users of NetApp. So that's really nice to have that ability to do it across everything, rather than it's not just Azure, it's everything we've got. Similarly, along the same vein, and this is just Arc here, but I could have combined it with the Azure data. So this is a simple summary report of the kind of operating systems in use across on-premises in this case. And then I've done a summary down here of hardware-wise what it is, and then some color coding based on versions. But again, that's more about the visualization of it. The key point is that Arc's made the data available, and that's the advantage of having it. It's really useful and enables lots of other things. So up until now, it's kind of just been reporting. This is all just data that's been fetched by the agent, and it's kind of allowed some reporting and governance activities. What we haven't really talked about is kind of actually doing things on the server. So not just seeing things, but actually doing things. So moving on to patch management. So there's a slight extra step you have to do to enable this. It's not something you have to do on any of the servers, but you have to enable an automation account on the Azure end to enable the kind of the scheduling element to work. But that's a minor one-off activity though to enable that. But once that's in place, we can then use the Azure portal to control all of our patching on those servers we've installed the Arc agent on. So you can see here there's one patch due for installation. It's the standard Windows Update one. And then I can use this interface to push that patch. In fact, as you can see there, to multiple machines. So again, it's enabling that management at scale. And if I click to the next slide, so the scheduling would then enable us to choose when to do it, which updates we want to apply. It might not be all of them. It allows us to pick and choose. And then the possibility to run scripts before or afterwards is also there. So that enables us from the Azure portal to completely manage the patch kind of installation on all those remote machines, and that is both Windows and Linux. It's grayed out here because I selected it from a Windows machine, but it also allows you to completely control Linux. So maybe I didn't make that point earlier on, but it's both a Windows and a Linux feature. This, in fact, the whole thing's Windows and Linux. It's not just aimed at Microsoft. It will cover both, as we see there, and actually multiple flavors of Linux too. As we kind of covered the reporting earlier on, as you might guess, all of that kind of patch information is also pushed in by the agent, and that allows us to run patch management reports. For example, is that KB that was mentioned, this one perhaps, is that installed on all of the servers? Where's it missing from? And we can report at scale. So across all of Azure, across all of on-premises where the Arc agent's been installed. So again, that's really powerful, the ability to have everything in a single view. So that's patch management. Next up is change tracking. Again, this has got the ability to be done across one or many machines as a whole, but it allows us to see over time when things are being changed. So when software is being installed, when Windows service state changes, if there are file or registry changes, if you configure that to be done. So it's kind of similar in a way to Tripwire, if you're familiar with that on a Linux platform. So it would allow us to flag up when changes have been made that perhaps we weren't expecting. And again, that's kind of organization-wide once this is in place. So again, that's really, really powerful. In a very similar vein to the change management, it also allows us to do inventory management. So we can see, in this case, all of the Windows services that are on the server, as well as all the software that's installed. Now, one of our use cases that we're looking into at the moment is we want to know about the Java installations on all of our servers. And this enables us to do that. So we can query, again, using that custom language I showed earlier on, because it's in that format we can query it. We can query the kind of inventory table that sits behind this screen, join it with the same table that's populated from the Azure resources, and we can quickly produce a report of anything that's got Java in the software name, and we can build that summary report to then take forward and help with that planning around how we deal with all of that Java software installation. So again, it's showing the power of all that information that's fetched in by Arc. So that's inventory. Next up is security integration. So again, if you're familiar with the Azure portal, this is going to look very familiar. To be honest, we're still looking into what this gives us. So you can see it's picked up some things immediately here because we've switched it on. It's not on by default, but we have switched it on. We're still investigating exactly how that fits in to our kind of processing. It has got some link to Defender ATP and the licensing for that, about whether that's included or not. So we're trying to work out exact costings, but also whether this information is actually useful, or are we already receiving it from other sources. But the security option is there, and you can see that that is maybe useful to you, but we're still looking into the possibilities there. Similarly, and again, this is fairly small, I don't know how readable this is Azure Policy. So what Azure Policy allows you to do is define a kind of set of compliance rules of certain settings you might expect to be on the server, or I don't know, a certain registry key that needs to be a certain value to be compliant with your policies. So what you can do here is define those policies, and it will validate them against all of your Arc servers. So as an example, it's not deployed, but as an example, if you wanted to check that you're only using TLS 1.2 and above, you could write a policy that checked that, and then Arc would then be validating that, and you'd get a report saying, yes, these servers ABC are compliant, servers DEF aren't. So that allows you to do that at scale. Similar to the security one, we're still looking into this. Again, the policies part is an additional cost option, and we're still trying to investigate whether the cost justifies the kind of things it enables us to do. So that's still work in progress on the Azure policy part. So that kind of covers the basics, I guess, of all the stuff that Arc enables, at least at a high level, and hopefully gives you a flavour. What I haven't talked about yet is the cost, and that's the next slide. So this is a kind of as-is summary of what it's costing us at the moment. So if we ignore this line, I think, because that's only because we've chosen to retain some of the data for longer. So we're paying, well, roughly €2,000 a month we have, and that's for 400 machines. So that's roughly €5 per machine per month we're paying. And you can see that's a lot of data it's being fetched, which is what's driving the cost up. One of the things I've fed back to Microsoft is that particularly the screens and the data that's populating those network diagrams, that's by far the biggest contributor to the data that's being fetched. And it's whether there's some way of tuning that down. I don't think it needs to fetch the information as often as it does, and some ability to tune that would, I think, drastically reduce these costs. So I fed that back. Whether it goes anywhere, I don't know. But at least for us, this isn't unreasonable. I think other tools doing similar things and kind of allowing us to have the same functionality, you'd probably be paying the same or more, I think, to enable it. But at least that gives you a flavour of costings. I wouldn't base any kind of purchasing decisions on what I'm saying here. You may get very different figures depending on your agreements with Microsoft, but this just gives you a ballpark of the kind of figures you might be expected to pay for the basic features. I hinted at it on the previous screens. There are some of the features that are extra on top of that. So, for example, the security one is more on top. I don't know the cost for that one. That's more linked to the security pricing. And Azure Policy, the other one that's extra, that's €5 per server per month. So Azure Policy kind of doubles the cost to have that. So just bear that in mind if that's something that interested you, that the policy part will make a big difference to the cost. So summary so far of what we found. It's very easy to onboard. Agents easier to push out. For us, we actually got our third-party supplier to script it. That was very straightforward, and then it's just pushed out to all the agents, and then it's kept up to date via normal Windows updates and normal Linux patch processes. So it's a one-off thing, and then it's automatically kept up to date. For us, at least, those costs are acceptable. They're reasonable for the value we get from having all this information. Application teams really like it. The visibility that they didn't have before, they've now got, so they're really pleased with it. And from a central management team point of view, having that single view and the ability to kind of do these queries across the estate is really powerful, is really valuable. So we're happy with it, and we think Microsoft have done a really good job, to be honest. I think we're quite impressed with what they've done. So that's kind of where we are so far. In terms of what's next for Uniper, so we plan a wider rollout. So we've already done quite a lot of service, as you can probably see from the slide on the cost. But we're planning a wider rollout to kind of cover as much of the estate as possible. So there's a big rollout happening in Holland at the moment, which will then further onboard the servers. There's then the 2 points I mentioned around the security and the Azure policy. It's working out exactly what we get for our money, essentially, and is it worth us investing in those other two elements? So there's still some work to be done there. We also have an Azure Stack in one of our locations. If you're not familiar with it, that's kind of like cloud in a box, for want of a better term. So you buy a piece of hardware from a third-party vendor that's kind of approved by Microsoft, and it enables you to use some of the Azure features in an on-premises server. And linking that in with the Azure Arc functionality enables you to do some additional things. So we're looking to see what that offers and whether that's useful. And then lastly, the SQL Server part. I showed it on a much earlier slide, and it's just seeing what that makes available. We do have some on-premises servers with SQL Server on, so it's what that additional option then gives us. So that's kind of where we're heading with Juniper. In terms of what Microsoft are actually doing with the product, this is quite interesting where they're taking it actually. So they've moved away from just having it as a kind of machine tool, and they're adding in a lot of additional support for extra things. So as an example, you can see here that this is a screen from the main Arc screen. So the servers was the one I've been talking about all the way through. There's the SQL Server, which is the one I showed with the extensions. There's the Azure Stack I mentioned. But perhaps the most interesting one, and the way Microsoft seems to be taking this, is it also enables you to manage Kubernetes clusters. So that just gives you the visibility of Kubernetes on its own. But actually, it opens up a lot of interesting new possibilities. So what Microsoft have then done is if you've configured your Kubernetes cluster and linked it to Azure Arc, what it'll actually enable you to do is deploy some of the services that are PaaS components. So again, I'm assuming that everyone on the call is familiar with Azure a little bit, but these are platform services. So instead of kind of taking a virtual machine, installing a web server on it, and deploying some files to it to create a website, you could just deploy a web app from App Services, and all of that kind of lower level web server stuff is just done by Microsoft. You just kind of copy your files on there that make up your site. But what they've enabled with this is, instead of that only being possible in Azure, if you've got Kubernetes linked to Azure Arc, you could write a web app or a logic app or a function app, and you could then deploy that to an on-premises environment. Now that opens up a whole load of possibilities about how you might want to develop your applications. So for example, Azure Functions, you can very easily, actually Functions is a very bad example, but Azure Logic Apps, there's got a kind of nice click, click, click style development. You can very quickly develop a Logic app and then deploy it to an on-premises environment via this Kubernetes interface. So it opens up a whole new world of possibilities of how to work with Azure and the applications. So that's coming. Well, actually, some of it's already live. So you can see the Postgres is in preview, but actually these other things are actually live. So you can do that today. And the general direction they're going with is getting it as close as possible to what you see in the Azure portal for, at least for virtual machines. You see it getting more and more similar with every release, every kind of iteration of the product, that it's getting closer and closer that you can't tell the difference between an Azure VM and an on-premises VM managed by Azure Arc. And you can see that they are heavily investing in this area. I think they see it as a key technology, and I wouldn't say it's daily, but it's definitely weekly or monthly. You'll see new announcements, new features. It's a really big investment area for them. So that kind of sums up the kind of the journey we've kind of been on so far. The benefits we've seen already from just the data that it's fetching, the reporting and management it allows us to do, and kind of where we see it heading for us. So hopefully that gives you at least a flavour for it, what the technology does, and maybe sparks off some ideas about how it may be useful in your organisation too. But we're really impressed with it. We think Microsoft has done a really good job, and it's a really key area for us to invest in and expand in the next year or two. So we're really pleased with it. So with that said, hopefully that's all made sense as I've been going along. With that said, I'll move on to questions and open it up to the floor.
So, Rich, there's no questions in the chat at the moment, so I'll ask you a question first. So Microsoft obviously are pushing more and more stuff towards the cloud. Where do you see this? What's this being couched at? Is this accepting that companies are still going to have an on-premise footprint, or Microsoft still encouraging an on-premise footprint because they can't build data centers fast enough? So how's this being pitched, would you say?
So I think it's got a number of use cases. So it's, for Juniper at least, it's enabling us to have the management of the stuff that can't go into cloud right now. So there's some reason that it's got to be perhaps physically in an environment. It might have some, I don't know, some dongle where it's physically got to be connected to some piece of kit, and that just can't ever move into a public cloud environment. So that's one use case. There's the legal, I guess, compliance use case where it might have to stay in country. And as of right now, Microsoft haven't got data centers in every country. So there's countries where that's just not possible. And even in the countries where they have perhaps got a presence, it still may not be compliant with the country's legal rules. So as an example, in Germany, there is a specific German version of Azure, but it still might not meet your compliance requirements. So some of the legalities are that it has to be worked on only by German staff, which Microsoft still can't guarantee, even though it is located in Germany. So you get those kind of cases. But there's also the cases where people are still kind of starting their cloud journey. I know Juniper are quite well along, but there's a lot of companies are kind of on the start of that journey, and it's kind of an easy way of kind of getting introduced to clouds, getting some of the benefits of having it without fully moving in. And I guess it's then giving you the push to move into Azure longer term. So there's a few different use cases, but I think Microsoft acknowledged that as much as they might want it, they're not going to get everything into Azure cloud. In the cases that they can't, at least they can help the customer, or I guess monetize it in a different way, even if it can't go into Azure. So, but it's definitely a big key investment area for them. Definitely see that.
There's still no questions in the chat. Before I've got another question for you, but before that, if you prefer to ask a question verbally, there is a function on there to raise your hand. If you hover over the client or the browser, there's a function that says reactions, and in there you'll see a raise hand option. And that's what I can see on my device anyway. Second question to you, Rich. So we've talked about on-premise. Can this functionality be used on other clouds like AWS and the Oracle Cloud and Google?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not something we've tried just because we haven't got anything deployed into those other clouds, but it's essentially no different. I think very early on, I quickly showed the slide from Microsoft where it was showing kind of other clouds on that picture. But Arc doesn't care. As long as it's a supported operating system, it'll happily install, whether that's AWS, Google, Oracle Cloud, on premises, in a cupboard in an office. As long as that machine is a supported OS and can reach the endpoints to send the data, it'll install. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I've got another question. Oh, a question from Benjamin. I would love to submit a question, but to be honest, I'm quite new as Azure. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to ask, Benjamin? I can release the mic if you wish. Just see if I can find him. So if you wish to speak, Benjamin, you should be able to unmute. Okay, fine. Okay, are there any last questions before, otherwise we'll bring the meeting to a close? I can see no hands being raised and there's no additional chats in the chat window. Okay, Thank you very much, Richard. The links to the next talks are also in the chat if you want to follow URLs. Other than that, I wish you all a good evening. Thank you for joining.